And thank you all for coming tonight and listening to this story. When I first heard about the events for this week, for the Hopewell Heritage Week, I knew that the theme was how geography and landforms and things like that have affected life in Hopewell. And immediately I jumped to the Revolution period for thinking about that. So it's been fun putting all of this together, and I hope that you will enjoy it. Obviously, one of the elements, the geographic elements that we think about in the Revolution, is what's right outside. I'm looking at it, right out the window there now, the Delaware River. And it is important, but it's only one aspect of the geography that affected people's lives. Before I really get into it, I just want to acknowledge a source, Richard Hunter and Richard Porter's book, Hopewell, A Historical Geography. This was written back in the 90s, but boy, is it just full of information about Hopewell Township and how geography has influenced its history and the lives of people in the whole township of Hopewell. It happens to have on the cover a picture of Howell Farm, which also makes it appealing to me. But I've used this book so many times, and I just wanted to acknowledge it and recommend it because of the theme of the Heritage Week. Make it available to everybody, make it knowledgeable to everybody. Well, Hopewell's experience in the Revolution was determined a great deal by its geography, by its location. During the Revolutionary War, this is a map of New Jersey and its county structure at that time. Now, obviously, there's no Mercer County at this time. General Mercer is still alive and well. And so, there's no county named after him yet. But we are part of Hunterdon County at the time of the Revolution. But notice that is in kind of a central location. Notice also the diagonal line going from north to south, east-west diagonal. That was the line separating East Jersey from West Jersey. Originally there was two New Jerseys. There were two colonies, East Jersey and West Jersey, and they combined in about 1702, 1704. But even still, by the time of the Revolution, people thought of two New Jerseys. Very often, the documents that I would go through looking at various events in New Jersey during the Revolution, people referred to it not as New Jersey, but as the Jerseys, okay, to get both of them in there. And we notice that Hopewell Township was in West Jersey and was in Hunterdon County. And again, just take in the idea that it's right in the middle of things, but it's all on the west side. That might imply that it was not going to be as involved in the Revolution as if it had been in the east. But I'll explain about why that was not necessarily true. It's also important to look at Hopewell Township, just like New Jersey, as its locations among the 13 colonies. Again, is right in the middle, okay, from north to south. And it's right between probably the two most important seaports. Anybody from Boston, excuse me, okay? New York and Philadelphia, Philadelphia was the biggest seaport, okay? One of the biggest in the world at that time. And New York is on the upswing getting there. So people in East Jersey tended to root for New York teams, and people in West Jersey tended to root for Philadelphia teams. And that also they sent their produce, to those areas to make their living. So Washington's going to spend a lot of time in New York and Philadelphia, and the Revolution is going to be focused on that area, and that's going to put Hopewell right in the middle of the Revolution. Now, if you take a closer look at New Jersey, the arrows coming across New Jersey between New York and Philadelphia show probably the main transportation route by land that people would take. At the time of the Revolution, stagecoaches would be going up and down those roads all the time. It was generally about a 2-day trip, and people would stop over either in Princeton or in Trenton, and then continue on the next day. But notice where Hopewell is, right at the side of that road. So there's people coming through the area that are going to become aware of Hopewell, and Hopewell is certainly going to become aware of those people. It also has a river, the Delaware, which was a major transportation route at the time of the Revolution. And again, it's right, butting right into Hopewell. So that's going to bring a lot of the Revolution to us. So I think you can see from the transportation aspects that a lot of stuff is going to happen here. And we'll see that happen. Now, everybody has heard of Durham boats, right? And you associate Durham boats with Washington's Crossing on the night of December 25th. What I really want to get across to you quickly is people in Hopewell at the time of the Revolution knew all about Durham boats. They saw them every day because the Durham boats were going up and down the Delaware as commerce. They didn't carry people. They did that one night, but they didn't carry people. They carried produce. They carried heavy loads. They carried iron ore. They carried coal. They carried all kinds of agricultural products in casks and in bags and things like that. And they just went up and down the river. They were the semi-trucks of their day, okay? And they were all over the river. Again, we recognize them from Washington Crossing, and we'll say more about that in a little bit. One thing I do want to get across about Durham boats right from the beginning, they were not designed to go across the river. They were designed to go up and down the river. So anybody going from New Jersey to Pennsylvania in a Durham boat was really weird, okay? If you're going from Easton to Philadelphia in a Durham boat, that's much more common. That's what they were designed to do. If you want to go across the river, you went by a ferry boat. And the ferry boats, as you can see, look very different and are constructed very different than the Durham boats. These were also very well known to the people of Hopewell. There were several ferries that crossed over, not just the one at Johnson's Ferry, but there was one closer to Howell Farm called Cox's Ferry, named after Daniel Cox, who was the primary owner of land in this part of New Jersey, going back generations. And he had a ferry for a while. So the ferries were numerous. And I just want you to take a look at them. They're not carrying bundles of stuff, and they're not carrying people. They're basically carrying horses and wagons, stagecoaches, things like that. You could also walk on and off and ride, just like you could ride a ferry boat today without your car. But they were really designed and structured in order to facilitate horses and wagons. And that's going to be important on the night of the 25th also. Now, the topography of Hopewell, and this is a map from the book that I showed you earlier, Hunter and Porter book. Oops. Okay. I didn't see that it had moved things there. I kept looking. Anyway, you see the hills in the northern parts of Hopewell. Those are not massive. They're not the Alps or anything like that. And, Baldpate Mountain, if you know that, that's one of the more severe ones. But still, it's going to allow for farming. And that's what Hopewell is going to be all about during the Revolution, farming. You see all the dots on here. Now, this is a 19th century map. It's not revolution, it's after the Revolution, but it gives you an idea of just how solidly covered with farms Hopewell was. It was farmland, and I think it's also important to note that there was a lot of woodland also. There were, in valleys and on hillsides and areas that did not lend themselves to plowing and growing crops. They let trees grow for a very good reason. Every farmer needed trees. He didn't need the shade, he needed the wood. Okay? Everything is going to be built out of wood. It's a wood culture. Okay? They're also going to cook on wood burning. They're going to heat by burning wood. So wood is going to be extremely important. This is going to be something that soldiers passing through, be they American soldiers, British soldiers, Hessian soldiers, or whatever, they're going to need wood. They're not just going to pass through, because they're going to have to eat while they're coming through. They're going to have to rest while they're coming through. Depending on the temperature, they may need to be heated. There's just so many things that wood is going to be a part of their life. And there was plenty of that around Hopewell also. There were also streams that many of them fed into the Delaware River. And those streams were important coming down from these hills because they could supply power for water-powered grist mills, sawmills, things like that. And because this is so much farmland, and New Jersey was growing so much wheat during the time of the Revolution, and sending that wheat on down the river on a boat to Philadelphia, that the grist mills were extremely important. And we'll see a little bit more about that on the next slide. Just to give a kind of a snapshot of what Hopewell Township was like as a farming region. Tax records from the Revolutionary period are very illustrative. People paid taxes, by the way, to support the war. Okay, they didn't pay on a regular schedule like you'd expect, not like annually. Sometimes they paid 2 or 3 times a year. Whenever the new Congress would decide we need more money to support the war, they'd put out a tax. In 1780. There were also taxes levied in 1778 and a little bit later on in that too. So I kind of took a middle of the Revolution picture here. Notice the number of men who are assessed for taxes, 125. Most of those guys are going to be farmers, or they're going to be people who support farming. Only 2 women were taxed. Only 2 women owned enough property to be taxed. Okay. 13 widows, on the other hand. Those 2 women were married. Okay, so the widows, and some of them, had their husband's property, and they were being taxed for that. There were also some single men who perhaps didn't own their own farm, but maybe they rented or they owned a patch of a farm where they were hired out as workers, and there's some of those. And then there was 1 free black man who was taxed. I don't know if he owned land or not. I know that it was not supposed to happen. There were theoretical colonial laws against blacks owning land. But I know of at least 1 other black man in New Jersey who owned land at that time that I wrote a book about. Okay, and so Jacob Francis owned land also, but not in Hopewell. The land holdings, 9 farms were more than 300 acres. That's good size. A lot of those farms were big because the farmer purchased land, even if he couldn't put it to productive use right away, he was going to break it up and will it to his kids, his sons, later on in life. 32 farms were between 200 and 299 acres, 137 in the 100 to 199. So that's really your primary size, is that 100 to 200 acres. And then there are a few small farms, less than 100 acres. I would say the middle class was more like the 100, maybe to 150 acres. And after that, then you started getting into upper levels of economic society. People were taxed for their belongings. Slaves were their belongings, one type of their belongings. I put it in quotes because it appears as slaves in their records. Today, we would use the term enslaved persons. Okay? I didn't want to keep dehumanizing the slave population by using that word without explanation. Notice there were 52 enslaved. That doesn't mean there were only 52 enslaved persons. Those 52 enslaved persons taxed were all males, old enough to work and not too old to work. They were productive, in other words, for their owner in terms of farm work and craft work and things like that. If they had a wife and they had kids, they don't appear in the tax records. So there were probably a number more than 52 enslaved people. Thankfully, there were a lot of horses. You guys know I love horses. So they varied a lot from year to year, but generally 700, 800, 900 horses. Split up, as you can tell here, that's only 2 or 3 per farm. People didn't have a lot. They would work a horse like a tool. They didn't have horses standing around doing nothing like at Howell Farm. Okay? They didn't get rest. They got worked until they couldn't work anymore, and then they got put down or sold. Okay? So most farmers would only have 2, 3 horses. They were also expensive. Cattle produced income with their milk. They made a lot of butter and cheese. A lot of that got sent down on Durham boats to Philadelphia also. So cattle were important. Some of those cattle were boys, by the way, not just milk cows, and they were workers. They were oxen. Ox power was a primary source of power. It was used even more than horsepower. Just to explain that a little bit, the tools that they had to be pulled, like a plow, they worked better with oxen and not with horses. Horses worked better pulling a wagon, things like that. During the 19th century, the 100 years after the Revolution, it's totally going to change. The oxen are going to go out of business, and the horses are going to become even more important as they invent new tools to be pulled that pull better by horses rather than oxen. Okay. So that's a little aside here. Hogs, it amazes me that they actually recorded number of hogs for the taxes, because the number of hogs that any farmer owned changed practically monthly. Okay, new births, hogs getting large, getting sold for meat. Every winter, they didn't want to keep feeding the hogs over the winter any more than they needed to, so a lot of them would get butchered, and they would put the meat up, and a lot of salted pork and things like that for the family. So number of hogs is constantly changing. I put riding chairs up there. Anybody know what a riding chair was back then? It was like a sports car. A horse-drawn, 2-wheeled chair sitting between those 2 wheels with a little bit of a platform. And, usually only held 1 person, maybe 2 at the most. And it was a sign of wealth. It was a luxury. And that's why it got taxed. Okay? So you can see there were 12 people who were wealthy enough to have a Rolls Royce, to have the riding chair at the time. Okay? Notice the businesses. Grist mills were the big thing. But also sawmills, fulling mills. Everybody know what a fulling mill is? It works with fabric. conditions fabric. Tan yards, making leather. There were two fisheries, okay, the river again, the shad and things like that. And there was one ferry that was taxed. That would be the one at Johnson's Ferry. And there were also several merchants. The merchants basically worked with the farmers. They took produce and then moved it somewhere else, or brought things from Philadelphia to sell to the farmers that the farmers couldn't get down to Philadelphia to buy. So there's all of that. But anyway, I hope that gives you an idea of the agriculture and the kinds of things that the people were doing here. Now, I think it's interesting to know that at the time of the Revolution, Hopewell Borough did not really exist. There was the Hopewell Old School Baptist Meeting House or church there. The pictures that you see here are of the 1822 structure, I think. There was a structure before that on that site, but I couldn't find any even drawings of it, so I'll give you that. Right next to that church is this stone with a plaque on the front. This stone existed at the time of the American Revolution in front of the church, because this is what you got up on when you wanted to get into your carriage, or when you got out of your carriage and wanted to get to the ground. This is like a stepping stone to help with your loading and unloading. It was there. It served an interesting purpose concerning the Revolution. On Sunday, April 23rd, 1775. Now think about that date, April 23rd, 1775. 4 days after, April 19th, battles of Lexington and Concord. This gives you an idea of how long it took news to travel. It's going to arrive in Hopewell 4 days after it happened up in Massachusetts. A rider is going to bring it, and he rides up to the church, and when the church is over, he nabs people and he starts telling them about it. And one of the parishioners is a man named Job Houghton, who was a very prominent man. And he got up on this platform to talk to the people and give them the message that he'd gotten about Lexington and Concord. And he said, after he talked for a bit, "Men of New Jersey, the redcoats are murdering our brethren in New England. Who follows me to Boston?" And in the story, every man answered, "I will, I will." Okay? Well, think about farming in the month of April. Are these guys going to go to Boston and just let their farms go? Job Houghton didn't even go. Okay? He never got on the bus to get to Boston. Okay? That doesn't mean he didn't participate in the Revolution, or any of the other men who heard him didn't participate. They did, and we'll talk about that a bit. But I think this is a cool story from Hopewell's history, even though it may be overstating what happened just a bit. It was just about this time that the Continental Army was being formed, not too long after Lexington and Concord. And there were some men from Hopewell who enlisted in the Army. I think it's important to know that these were not necessarily farmers. They may have been sons of farmers. They may have been, connected to a farmer in some way, family-wise. But the man who owned the farm probably didn't go. Probably a worker. Because being a soldier in the Continental Army meant you were full-time soldiering. You had to give up your day job, your regular job. And men weren't going to give up their farm. So most men could not be full-time soldiers. Therefore, they're going to become militiamen. But I think it's important to recognize that there was a manpower problem in the Revolution. And Hopewell is going to be affected by that. Hopewell, as we're going to see as we go on here, the militiamen were required and called out all too frequently to go on active duty. But they're also expected to grow all the food. Not only to support their family, but as the war goes on, to feed the Continental Army. Continental Army is going to spend more time in New Jersey than basically any other state. And they need to be fed. And Hopewell and the areas around it are going to be some of the closest places to get food from. So they're constantly going to be asked to submit food or give up food. They're also going to need to make supplies for that army. Those tanners that we talked about, in the tax records, where is that leather going to go? It's going to go into saddles. It's going to go into harness. It's going to go into belts to carry all kinds of stuff. Very, very important stuff. And so the tanner, is he going to go out and shoot at British, or is he going to make leather so that the American army can be well equipped? I wouldn't want to be in that decision-making situation. But anyway, most men had to become militiamen. It was the law. We often hear about men volunteering for the militia, joining the militia. All they were doing was obeying the law. Not that they were so excited about the revolution that they wanted to get involved. Now, certainly some of them did, but not everybody. Being in the militia meant they were part-time. Notice the age range. Sophomores in high school through men in their 50s. Okay? If they're either too young or too old, they didn't have to be in. There were also some exemptions from time to time. For example, there were not permanent exemptions, but depending on what was going on, leather workers might be exempt for a month or two from being called out for duty because they needed that. Believe it or not, school teachers, okay, but not consistently, only periodically. Militiamen, unlike the Continental Army that theoretically got their uniforms and their weapons and their equipment from the government, militiamen had to supply their own. That doesn't mean they always did, because not everybody could afford to do that. But they were supposed to, by law, do that. They were supposed to attend training and parades. Okay? And they were supposed to come whenever they were called out to go on active duty. But who's going to do the farm work? That becomes the issue, and we'll talk about that a little bit. Now, I gave you a picture of a couple of New Jersey militiamen. You recognize them? Anybody? Asher? Yes, that's Matt Skick and George Skick. I don't think that Matt lives in Hopewell anymore. After he grew up and got married, he's actually working at the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia. But I think George still lives in Hopewell. And they were reenactors, or are reenactors, and they allowed me to take pictures of them years ago. But they represent the militia. Notice that the uniforms are not what you might expect, a Continental Army uniform to look like. They're a little bit more civilian looking. Now, the geographic location of Hopewell, between New York and Philadelphia, the way the revolution went, that meant that the Hopewell militiamen were going to be called out all too frequently. For the years 76 to 82, 6 years or more, they're going to be called out sometime every year, and usually for a pretty good period of time. At the same time, Washington is saying, come on, feed the army, feed the army. Now, the militia was organized I use the word neighborhood in quotes. It was organized geographically. In other words, you didn't have a man say, I'm going to raise a company of militia. I'm going to be the captain and I'm going to go out and recruit guys. No. It meant all the guys living in a geographic area, defined geographic area, would get together and they would elect a man to be their captain. Okay? And the other officers too, the lieutenant, ensign and whatnot, sergeants, etc. So everybody in the company knew each other. But think about a problem here. If that company gets called out for active duty, every man in the community leaves. Who's going to farm? Their wives. Okay? Who's going to take care of the farm? The wives. Okay? Or an older man who can't be in the militia, or their younger sons that are old enough to help out with the farm but aren't old enough to be in the militia yet. But it's really going to cut down on the economics in that farm area. What they're actually going to do later on is they're going to divide every company. They did it once by halves, by thirds, by fourths, but they would make subgroups in the company, and they would call out subgroups at the time rather than a whole company. And they would take 4 or 5 subgroups from 4 or 5 different companies and combine them into a makeshift short-term company for a month. Now think about that. When these guys are trying to work together, they don't even know the other guys in their unit half the time. Other times they do. So it caused some problems. But anyway, some of the Hopewell captains were Ralph Guile, whose father was a minister, by the way, John Hunt, Tim Titus, who was from the family that where we are today, right now, is named after Titusville, okay? And look at our man here, Job Houghton. He becomes a militia captain instead of going to Boston, okay? And he's going to spend the war first as a captain, then he's going to get promoted to lieutenant colonel of the whole regiment, not just the company. And then there's Henry Phillips, whom I have to mention, because he lived on what is today Howell Farm. Okay? And we'll see how he comes in just a little bit. Now, in addition to those part-time militiamen, when the British landed at New York and threatened to take over New York City, Washington asked for some full-time militiamen in New Jersey. So the colonial government, or the new province government, raised a brigade, several regiments of 5-month levies. In other words, men volunteered to serve full-time for 5 consecutive months. And that's from June on, the heart of the farm year. Okay? But they went to defend that with Washington. And so they were full-time for 5 months. Job Houghton, by the way, was one of those guys. He went to New York if he didn't go to Boston. Back here in Hopewell, around that time, lived John Hart. And John Hart, of course, was in Philadelphia working on the Declaration of Independence. And that got signed, passed on July 2nd and signed on July 4th. And that document that John Hart helped make was read in New York City on July the 8th. And many of those men, like Job Houghton, those 5-month full-time militiamen, that's where they heard the Declaration of Independence read, was right in New York City. And then they were witness to, and perhaps participated in, pulling down the statue of King George III. So they're right in the middle of it. They're right in the middle of a campaign that starts with the Battle of Long Island, the Battle of Harlem Heights, the Battle of White Plains. There were Hopewell 5-month militia guys at all of those battles. Okay? After the New York campaign was over, and Fort Washington and Fort Lee are taken by the British decide they want to come into New Jersey to get some of that good farmland, not around Hopewell, but up around Newark, okay? Because that was good farmland then, okay? So Washington starts to pull back through New Jersey, and the British follow him, and they follow him all the way to New Brunswick. Now, at New Brunswick, those 5-month enlistments of those full-time militiamen, they run out. They can go away from Washington. They can leave Washington and go home, even though the British are still chasing them, right across New Jersey. And they do. They do go home because they know the British are coming to the Hopewell area, and they want to protect their property and protect their family. It doesn't mean they're going to leave the revolution. It just means they're going to, I signed for 5 months. 5 months are up. Now somebody else can come in. We know from documents from the Houghton family, Job Houghton had 2 sons who were also in the militia. Okay? He was getting towards the age where he could have gotten out of the militia, but he had 2 sons. And at least one of them applied for a pension and gave the story of how their enlistment was up here, and as Washington continued with his Continentals to Trenton, they kind of went along with him and then helped Washington at Trenton to set up to get his troops across to Pennsylvania ahead of the British. And they helped him with the ferries, they helped him with Durham boats, the whole thing. So Hopewell guys were helping out very much in this situation. And from December 2nd to 8th is when Washington crossed all of his troops from New Jersey, basically at Trenton, all the way to Bucks County. During that week, from the 2nd to the 7th, he crossed at Trenton. Some people crossed at Howell's Ferry or Yardley Ferry, and some at Johnson's Ferry, McConkey's Ferry. Hopewell militiamen were involved with all of that. And one of the things that Washington did the best in his whole career was he decided when he's going to cross the river, he's going to make sure there are no boats left behind. Not just boats that he used might get left behind. Any boat in a garage, in a barn, any boat just sitting anywhere on the New Jersey side was going to come over to Pennsylvania, so the British couldn't use it. It was Hopewell militiamen, as well as other militiamen from today's Ewing Township and Lawrence Township and this area, Amwell Township. They helped gather up all these boats and get them over to the Bucks County. Civilians also were trying to get out of New Jersey. Okay, I don't know why anybody wanted to get out of New Jersey, but these guys did at this time because the British were coming down at them, and they were scared to death. So these civilians that are crossing, a lot of them are women and children, not just men. At Johnson's Ferry, we know about 2 women who crossed there, and also a child by one of them, and also the father of one of them, who was the Presbyterian minister in Trenton. Lydia Spencer, the younger daughter of Reverend Spencer, recorded that so many frightened people were assembled, with sick and wounded soldiers, all flying for their lives, and with hardly any means of crossing the river. They've been taking the boats, and getting them across, not just using them. But they were able to apparently get some back. So her older sister, Margaret Spencer Sargent, who was married to Congressman Jonathan Dickinson Sargent from Princeton, and her new baby, they were also there. And she recorded, "We were unspeakably delighted when we got over safely and into a little hut where we spent the night with a company of American soldiers on their way to join General Washington." But this is just a tiny image of all these people that were trying to get across the river and the problems that they had. Then on December the 7th, believe it or not, the British had stayed in New Brunswick from December 1st to December 7th. They didn't chase down. That's because Lord Howe only wanted northeastern New Jersey. He didn't really want to beat up on Washington. He wanted to get that farmland. But Cornwallis and other officers convinced him, no, let's go take Philadelphia. So we got to get through New Jersey. So Cornwallis starts following Washington down. And basically on December the 8th, he comes down and Washington gets the last of his army across at Trenton on the morning of the 8th. And early in the afternoon, Cornwallis's troops enter Trenton and take over. So now the British get that red area. And the blue area shows that Washington was, once he got his troops across, he was spreading them out across the river in order to prevent any efforts by the British to cross. And one of those places that he's going to prevent crossing is Johnson's Ferry. But the night of December the 8th, General Cornwallis was at Maidenhead or Lawrence Township, and he got orders from Howe, said, I want you to head out to Coryell's Ferry, today's New Hope and Lambertville. He says, they got ferries there, they got boats there. I've heard from people that Washington didn't get all the boats across there. It's far enough from Trenton that they didn't do it. He says, I want you to march overnight, leave at midnight, go through Pennington, go right by Howell Farm, which was the Phillips farm at that time, and go to Coryell's Ferry. Get us boats so that we can get after Washington and proceed down towards Philadelphia. Well, here's a picture you might recognize of Howell Farm. And this is Pleasant Valley Road. The red building is the old schoolhouse. And you see the chicken apartment houses there, the condos for chickens. That is 20th century. But you see a big red dot on the lawn, really the playing field for the school when it was. And Richard Hunter's archaeology company went over to Howell Farm, and they dug what you see in the lower left corner there. They found the foundation for the John Phillips house, which was the first house built in what is today Howell Farm, built in 1735. So there was a house standing where that red dot is when Cornwallis's troops came marching down Pleasant Valley Road early in the morning of the 9th of December. They were heading up to Lambertville, up to New Hope area. Well, they continued on to Coryell's Ferry, and then guess what they didn't find? Not a boat. All the boats had been removed. Well, these guys have been marching overnight after having a hard couple of days before that. They're tired, they're hungry, they're ticked off because they didn't complete what they were sent to do. And they're just told, okay, we're just going to go back. But we got nothing. So they came back the same route, and they passed by Howell Farm again to go to Pennington. Well, when they passed by this time, obviously, I show them going the wrong way. Turn them around, look at their backs here. They plundered the farm, and they beat up, assaulted John Phillips, the father of Captain Henry Phillips that we talked about before. They caused serious damage to the farm. And old Mr. Phillips survived, but he was really badly treated. They did that to a couple of farms on their way back because they were headed to Pennington. And I don't know if there's anybody from Pennington here now, but did you know that General Cornwallis lived in Pennington for about a week in December of 1776, from the December 9th to at least December 14th. And he stayed at the Swan Inn, which there's a picture of from the 19th century. It had been added onto, so that square shows the original building. Why General Cornwallis decided to make his headquarters there, it was probably because of Vito's Pizza right across the intersection there, okay? It certainly wasn't because directly across the street was the Presbyterian Church. The British felt very angered at Presbyterians. Several British officials had called the revolution the Presbyterian War, because Presbyterian ministers were some of the ones that were really rousing people up to participate in the revolution. That's why Reverend Spencer's family was trying to get out of town, as I mentioned earlier on, and why he had to get out of town. He had a price on his head. Okay, they wanted to get him. But anyway, they were there. To show you how upset they were with the Presbyterians, they really beat up the church. They demolished pews and things like that. They stabled horses in it. There are all kind of nutsy things that happened to that church. Then the British decided to occupy New Jersey about the 14th, and they spread troops throughout the central part of the state. And again, Hopewell is going to be right on the edge of that. And the British are going to be sending troops into Hopewell all the time. And so people like John Hart, who have a price on their head as Continental Congressman, they got to keep watching out for these British patrols and things like that. So you probably heard about John Hart's cave, where he had to take refuge probably several times. During the next week or so, the next 10 days, from the 14th to 24th, the British occupied New Jersey and the Americans Pennsylvania. But one thing that we forget about all the time is Washington kept crossing the Delaware, crossing from Pennsylvania now to New Jersey. Many of those crossings were small groups of soldiers. Some of them, at least, were Hopewell militiamen who came back to Hopewell to check out their farms, check out their families. Sometimes it was Hopewell militiamen who had gotten sick over on the Pennsylvania side and had to go home to recover. Okay? But whenever they went over, they looked for Hessian patrols, Hessian groups looking for food, anything like that, and they would attack them. The Hessians were taking casualties almost every day in December leading up to the big crossing. So we don't want to forget about that. And this is affecting people in Hopewell both ways, both Americans coming into town or into the township and also British coming into the township. The British were responsible for many atrocities. At least half a dozen rapes that were recorded, and beating up farmers, destroying farms, things like that. It was not a good time because of what the British were doing. By the 24th of December, General Philemon Dickinson, who was in charge of the New Jersey militia, he actually lived in Trenton, but now was over with Washington in Pennsylvania. He sent Washington a note on the 24th, on Christmas Eve, and he said Benjamin Combs, who was a British guy, now acts as commissary to General Howe at Pennytown, where he is giving out large quantities of continental pork. In other words, salted pork that the British had taken from local farmers and that kind of thing. Giving it to the poor and inhabitants that they were protecting because they were loyalists or whatever. But the person who gave the information to Dickinson, he tried to get some of that pork, see what would happen. But he was refused because he had not taken protection. What that means is, on the 30th of November, General Howe had put out a declaration saying, anybody involved in the revolution on the Patriot side who will sign a loyalty oath to the king and promise not to be involved in the revolution anymore will be pardoned for any actions they have already taken, military or whatever, political. So he said, you got to do that within 60 days. So that would be from November 30th to the end of December to the end of January. This is right in the middle of that time period. But if you didn't ask for the protection, he's not going to help you. Okay? So that was what people around Pennington were experiencing. That same day, that same letter, Dickinson also told Washington he had ordered a captain and 25 men, those would be militiamen, very likely Hopewell included in that group, and they are awaiting orders for what to do with General Nathaniel Greene. And then he finishes the letter by saying, the person bringing this letter to you is Captain John Mott and a few other militiamen who are going to General Sterling or Lord Sterling's camp, which was up around just south of New Hope on the Pennsylvania side. And they've got information about roads in New Jersey. And he says, Captain Mott can be relied on in every respect. Captain Mott owned a grist mill on Sullivan Way, right where the Trenton Psychiatric Hospital is. Okay? So he knew the area. And the men that he brought with him included George Muirhead of Captain Henry Phillips' company, who later on recollected that Washington had selected several militiamen from Hopewell to go with the Army and go a little bit ahead of the Army in New Jersey and let Washington know if they ran into anything important. They're kind of scouts for Washington on his march to Trenton, because he's planning the crossing at this point. He hasn't done it yet, but he's already getting New Jersey militiamen together to help him out. So on the night of December 25, 26, Washington crosses at McConkey's Ferry to Johnson's Ferry. And Johnson's Ferry was operated by the James Slack family at that time. Its previous owner had been the Johnsons. So the Slack family helps out. And this is what we think of as Washington's crossing of the picture. But when you think about Washington's crossing, I want you to totally disregard that picture. Totally. And think more of this. And even more of this. Ferry boats, as well as Durham boats. Washington was not the only guy who stood up in the boat on the way over. Everybody stood up because there were no seats in Durham boats. They were used to carrying rocks, not people. Okay? And they had water in the bottom that had leaked in. So you didn't want to be sitting down there. You're standing. They needed the ferry boats because he's bringing over artillery, not just people. And that artillery is drawn by horses. And he's also bringing wagons full of ammunition for the artillery that are drawn by horses. So think of those ferry boats that you saw before with the oxen or the horses pulling wagons. After the crossing, they had a 9-mile march to Trenton, and there were about 25 guys from the Hopewell, Ewing, and Lawrence area who showed Washington the road. Keep in mind, this was a dark, stormy night, and the roads don't have lights and street lights. They don't have signs. The Army had no idea where it was going. But those guides from Hopewell, among other places, really helped them out. Some of those guides included men with the name of Ian Burroughs, Stephen Burroughs, Joseph Inslee, Henry Simmons, Uriah Slack, son of the people who operated Slack's Ferry, and Ephraim Woolsey. Anybody know Woolsey Park? That was his family. He lived, in the Woolsey house there. So we remember him to this day. After the victory in Trenton, the Army came back with 900 Hessian prisoners, and they came back to Johnson's Ferry. They marched right through Hopewell with these Hessian prisoners and then crossed them over. Now, if you think it was bad the night of the 25-26 getting across, keep in mind, It's only 24 hours later, going the other way, and they got 900 extra people. And they've got 6 extra artillery pieces to get across. It was not a nice night to get back across. After that, the Battle of Princeton came a couple days later, and Hopewell was involved with that in a couple of ways. The primary way was that Dr. Benjamin Van Kirk, who lived in Hopewell, actually treated some of the wounded soldiers after the Battle of Princeton. He wrote in his journal, his medical journal, that on January the 6th, he went to John Drake's house to visit the soldiers and dress their wounds. And he did this this is just one entry. He made similar entries on other days. So Hopewell, got the wounded and the sick, from the Battle of Princeton. They got involved with it, in at least that way. And the last thing I want to talk to you about happened a year and a half or so later, in June of 1778. You know that Washington had been at Valley Forge during that winter, and the British had decided to leave Philadelphia, which they had captured the year before, and they're going to march across New Jersey to get back to New York, not to get to Pennsylvania, to get back to New York, just the opposite of what they had done before. And Washington, he says, well, are we just going to let them walk across New Jersey? What are we going to do? So he brought his army to Coryell's Ferry and cut across, and then 2 sons of John Hart, the Declaration guy, met up with Washington, and they guided him to Hopewell because John Hart had offered his house and his farm for the soldiers to stay at least one night. Well, hopefully you can read some of this. You probably know that that's Hopewell Borough, okay? You can see the yellow squares that I put there, one for the old school Baptist meeting house, and then one for the house of John Hart. Everybody coordinated on the map. And then the soldiers did the best they could to get shelter and to spend 2 nights, the 23rd and the 24th, on John Hart's farm and the adjoining farm of Abraham Golden. Now, this is still open space today, pretty much. And if you heard the talk on Tuesday, I think it was, archaeologists are looking at maybe doing something with that property to see if they can find things left over from the Army's encampment there. There were only about 12,000 troops that camped there. Imagine that. They must have left something behind. Yeah, only about 12,000. Okay. The Battle of Monmouth is going to take place just a couple days later on June 28th. But before that, on June 24th, George Washington is going to call his officers together for a meeting, and they're going to meet at what is known as the Joseph Stout House. But at that point, Joseph Stout had passed away, and John Price Hunt was residing there. I don't think he owned it. It hadn't been given to him or anything, but he was residing there. And that is the house that Washington made his headquarters. He didn't make his headquarters at John Hart's house. He probably had dinner there when they got there because John Hart's sons, were invited him to dinner. But this house is off Province Line Road, and it's apparently not visible from the road, but it is there still standing. At the Battle of Monmouth today in Freehold, New Jersey, there's a monument to the battle. And would you believe that at the base of that, there is a relief, I think it's brass relief, depicting the Council of War at Hopewell, a couple of days before the battle. That meeting with his officers, that Council of War, on that particular day is considered to be one of the most important councils of war he had. This was an important decision that they were making, whether to even encounter the British or just let them go. And they decided that they would at least get up close, and then hell broke loose and they had a battle. For the rest of the war, from 1778 to 1782. Hopewell militiamen continued. By the way, Hopewell militiamen also were at the Battle of Monmouth. I have to say that. And they continued to be called to the New York area. So even though they live in the western part of the state, and the British were across from the eastern part of the state, they needed militiamen in New Jersey so often that they got the guys from Hopewell to walk across the state. So if they got called out for a month of active duty, it probably took them close to a week to get there and a week to get back, and that didn't count in the month. Okay? And also during all this time, they're still raising food for the army, because Washington's army is still in and about New Jersey for a lot of the time. So that's the story of Hopewell, at least briefly, in the Revolution, and how its location and its geography influenced the experiences of the people. Thank you. And I'm very happy to take questions if you would like. I think we have at least one mic if you want to talk into that, or if you want to yell to me. Okay.
It was a tough time to feed the army. We had to feed the British too.
I should have mentioned that, shouldn't I? Yeah, I should have mentioned that we fed the British, because when the British troops came through, anytime they were here, they were taking food like crazy. They were also taking down fences and burning the wood to cook their food and to keep warm and all that stuff. I mean, they were just tearing the state up.
And also, not only was the Revolutionary War, it was like a civil war too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. Well, a number of patriots signed that document, and then signed a document a couple months later, or a couple weeks later, coming back again. Okay, after the 10 crucial days, after the battles of Trenton and Princeton. Even some leaders did that. Some of the leaders who'd been in government were really looked down upon for signing that thing, but most of them have been forced to. They'd had a gun put to their head and said, either sign this or you're out, or we're going to destroy your family. You know, people have signed for various reasons. But I think it's important. You know, you bring up an important point. Very often people will say, oh, it was 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. 1/3 were patriots, 1/3 were loyal, 1/3 were neutral. I don't think you can say that. And I don't think on any one day it was always the same people in the mix. People did change. Believe it or not, the signing of the Declaration of Independence, John Hart, getting that out, that caused some patriots to become loyalists. Because before the Declaration of Independence, they were fighting for the rights of Englishmen. They wanted equal rights. They wanted taxation with representation, because people in Britain had that, with Parliament. They were looking to be on the same level with people living in Britain and not second-class citizens. After the Declaration of Independence, they are not fighting for the rights of Englishmen. They're fighting to be independent, and they're committing treason, essentially. Okay? So a number of people switched at that point. I think it's also important, when I mentioned that men joined the militia, the Patriot militia, it was by law. A number of men, I am sure, signed into their local neighborhood company and went out when they got called, just because they didn't want to lose their property. And they would have been disobeying the law and would have lost their property if they hadn't been in the militia. So there's just all kinds of issues deciding who's on what side at what time, at the time. But you're very, very right to point out that it was a civil war. Absolutely a civil war. Well, the taxes were established by the new state government, okay, after the Declaration of Independence. You know, New Jersey signed a state constitution creating the state of New Jersey exactly the same time as the Declaration of Independence. And so that government, you know, did it. But they basically did it through counties. They're collecting it through counties. In New Jersey at the time of the Revolution, the state capital was much less important than the county seat to people. You know, New Jersey had two capitals during the Revolution, left over from those two original colonies. There was one in the east and one in the west. And even though New Jersey had become one colony, they still had two capitals, Perth Amboy and Burlington. And but you didn't do a lot of business at the state capital. You did a ton of business at the county. All the militia were organized by county. Okay. The companies that I talked about before, they were part of county regiments. Okay. So, yeah. Yes. As far as I know, I'm pretty sure it is, yeah. I don't know. That's an interesting question. Well, there are some differences, but you know, they have a lot of similarity, yeah. I don't know if there's any relation at all. It's interesting. Yeah, always that. Any other questions? Yeah. Question was, how did the people in Hopewell Township get their news during the Revolution? A lot of it was by word of mouth, by travelers. During most of the years of the Revolution, there was a newspaper published in Trenton that was a weekly and had information about what was happening in the war. There was another newspaper established up in northern Jersey, in Morris County area, that was definitely a patriot-oriented one. The one in Trenton was run by a Quaker, and it was a little bit more neutral, but it tended to go towards the patriot side. There were broadsides that were put up. For example, that proclamation that I talked about, that was done two ways. That was done in the newspaper, but it was also done as a separate thing to post, you know, all around for people to see. So it was all of those things. But a lot of it was just by word of mouth. Travelers. And again, Hopewell in this area, so many travelers going through that was really a big news thing. So news traveled at the speed of a horse. Thank you, Roger. Yes, Dan. Say that again. Oh, yeah. Right. Right. Easton. Well, during the Revolution, they wouldn't have stopped at Titusville because it didn't exist yet. Um, but yes, they would stop. They stopped at Trenton for sure. They would stop at they probably stopped at more at Coryell's Ferry. But no, they would stop along the way and just pull over to the side, you know, to either pick up something or unload something. But and very often it was just, they would stop at night for the crewmen to go ashore and camp out. You know, that happens some also. But yeah, there's a famous idea of Washington's that he wrote in a letter to tell people to collect these boats so he could get across, in early December. And he said, and especially get the Durham boats because they're the best for what I need to do. No, they weren't. They're up and down the river. They're not across the river. But he could use them. He could use them. Yeah. Hmm? Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, 518 wasn't there. There was another road, and the roads have all changed names and everything, of course. Yeah. 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 Yeah, well, you're traveling more like the speed of a horse. That's good. Yeah. Well, thank you. Yes. Oh, well, they going downriver, they basically went with the current. Now they did have oars, two on each side, and they did have a steering oar, at the back. But the Durham boat also, along the side, it had a board walkway, just wide enough for a man to walk at the top there. Are we still on here? I can. Oh, I'm sorry. I can see it here, but it can't. The Durham boat was the men also had long poles, 18-foot poles, and they could stand at one end and walk to the other end, pushing on the pole. I'm just going to hold it. Right. It took a lot longer to get up river than it did to get down river. Yes. Yeah. 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 Durham's could have a mast and a sail, but again, it was basically a square rig, if you know. Yeah, so the wind had to be just right. Yeah, the wind had to be just right and all of that. That would help. The men with the poles would have cheered for the wind. Yes, very much so. Yeah. And I always wonder how much they used the poles on the night of the crossing to get across the river with all of the water conditions and things like that. I'm sorry. No, I know. That's what I mean. They could have used poles. That's why I've never seen the reenactment use poles. They probably have, but I've just never seen it. Yeah.
Across from the workhouse, there's an island we call John's Island. There was an old bridge that actually sunk between John's Island and the Jersey shoreline.
That was after the war.
Was that a ferry on John's Island going across to from the workhouse?
Cox's Ferry that I mentioned before was pretty much in that area. I mean, John Cox owned land at the end of Pleasant Valley Road. Okay, and he owned several lots right along there. It was right in that area that he operated his ferry. There was a ferry that came over from Pennsylvania called Beaumont's Ferry,
Well, this is almost right across from Bowman's Tower.
Not Bowman, Beaumont.
Oh, Beaumont.
Beaumont, Beaumont. And I believe that's still the name that's used geographically on the PA side, village there or whatever. But that was another ferry connected to Hopewell. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you all very much. Enjoyed the questions.